we need to discuss something that the Western media, in its collective desperation, refuses to admit aloud. There is a truth about the war in Ukraine that changes absolutely everything. It is not the narrative you hear on the news channels in Washington, London, or Berlin. It is not the story of indomitable courage, the imminent victory of Kiev, and the supposed collapse of the Russian economy. That is the public version. It is theater. The truth, and it is a harsh truth, difficult to swallow for the elites living in their bubble of self-deception, is that the war has already been decided. And the West, in its blind arrogance, has lost. The economist Richard Wolff, one of the few remaining voices of lucidity in the American public debate, summarized this perfectly. He said, and I quote, "Washington's arrogance has just delivered Ukraine to Russia. Make no mistake. What Professor Wolff calls arrogance is, in fact, something far deeper, far more systemic. It is the symptom of an empire in terminal denial. The American empire, accustomed to dictating the rules of the global game for nearly 80 years, simply cannot psychologically process, cannot accept, a world that no longer automatically bows to its commands. The war in Ukraine was never, at its core, about Ukrainian sovereignty or democracy. That was the marketing. That is what they told you, the people, to justify the billions of dollars printed and sent, to justify the inflation that erodes your purchasing power. The war, in essence, was Washington's desperate attempt to stop the clock. It was a gamble, an all-or-nothing bet to break Russia, send a final warning to China, and force the rest of the world, the global south, the emerging multipolar world, back into obedience. It was meant to be the masterstroke that would reassert American unipolar hegemony for the 21st century. Instead, it has become the greatest geopolitical miscalculation, perhaps, in modern history. Washington was not just fighting Russia, it was fighting economic and demographic reality itself. And reality, as we know, always wins. Let us analyze the evidence of this arrogance. Let us dissect how this denial transformed into an act of economic suicide for the West. The first and most obvious weapon Washington drew was its favorite, economic sanctions. The elites in Washington, both Democrats and Republicans, genuinely believed, within their echo chamber, that they could turn off the Russian economy overnight. They believed that by confiscating Russia's reserves, some $300 billion, and by cutting off Russia's access to the SWIFT payment system, the ruble would evaporate, the Russian economy would implode within weeks, the starving Russian people would rise up against the government, and the Kremlin would beg for mercy. This was the fantasy. It was an illusion born from decades of reading their own think tank reports, which repeated the mantra that Russia was merely a gas station with nuclear weapons, a fragile and insignificant economy. They fundamentally underestimated the resilience of Russian society, which has lived with sanctions for over a decade. But more importantly, they underestimated the rest of the world. What happened in reality? The exact opposite of what was planned. As Professor Wolff tirelessly points out, global capitalism will always find a way. By attempting to isolate Russia from the Western system, Washington merely gave Russia the missing incentive to do what it should have done long ago, de-dollarize and diversify its partners. Russia turned to the east and to the south. And who did it find there? It found China, the largest industrial economy on the planet. It found India, the most populous nation on the planet. It found Iran, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, South Africa. These nations, comprising the majority of the world's population and a growing share of global GDP, looked at the sanctions and did not see an act of justice. They saw an opportunity. They began to buy Russian energy, oil, and gas at significant discounts. And, crucially, they began to pay in their own currencies. In yuan, in rupees, in rubles. Not in dollars. Russia, in turn, reoriented its entire supply chain. What it once bought from Germany, it now buys from China. The oil it once sold to Europe, it now sells to India and Asia. The result? The Russian economy did not collapse. It restructured. Last year, the Russian economy grew faster than the German economy, faster than the British economy, and faster than the United States economy. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF itself, had to embarrassingly revise its projections for Russia upward, month after month. The ruble did not evaporate. It is stronger today than it was before the war. Meanwhile, who truly paid the price for this Washington-led arrogance? You did. We did. The ordinary citizens of Europe and, to a lesser extent, the United States. The most obvious victim of this arrogance was Germany. Germany, the industrial powerhouse that drove the entire European Union, built its prosperity over the last 3 decades on 2 pillars: cheap, reliable energy from Russia, and unrestricted access to the massive consumer market in China. Washington's arrogance demanded that Germany commit economic suicide in the name of NATO solidarity. Under direct pressure from Washington, Germany was forced to cut off cheap Russian gas. The Nord Stream pipelines, which were the lifeline of German industry, were, conveniently, blown up. And what happened? The predictable. Energy costs in Germany skyrocketed. 10-20 times over. Inflation, which the Germans fear more than anything, exploded. And the mighty German industrial base, the heart of the European economy, began to grind to a halt. Companies like BASF, the largest chemical company in the world, an industrial giant, announced they were closing factories in Germany, laying off thousands, and, in a supreme irony, investing tens of billions of dollars to build their new factories in China. Washington did not save Europe from Russia. Washington saved Europe from its own industrial competitiveness. In a single geopolitical move, the United States eliminated its main economic competitor, Germany, using Ukraine as the pretext. It was an act of imperial sabotage disguised as an alliance. Europe, led by a political class in Brussels that obeys Washington more than its own citizens, meekly accepted its own deindustrialization. They now buy American liquefied natural gas, 4 to 5 times more expensive than Russian gas. And who pays this bill? The German worker, the French worker, the Italian worker, who see their utility bills soar and their jobs disappear. That is the first shot in the foot. The destruction of an allied industrial base. The second shot in the foot was inflation itself. Political elites, like Joe Biden, tried to blame Putin. They called it Putin's price hike. This is an insult to intelligence. The inflation was not caused by Russia. The inflation was caused by the West's sanctions against Russia. When you decide, out of arrogance, to remove one of the world's largest producers of energy, grain, fertilizer, and metals from the global market, you do not just punish that country. You create artificial scarcity. And by the most basic law of economics, scarcity creates higher prices. Gasoline prices, food prices, electricity prices. Everything went up. And it went up because Washington decided an economic war was a good idea. Meanwhile, Russia, selling its energy to Asia, increased its revenues. The West, on the other hand, imported the very inflation it had created. And this brings us to the third, and perhaps most fatal, miscalculation. The most powerful weapon of all, the dollar. For 50 years, American power was not just based on its aircraft carriers. It was based on the fact that the world needed dollars to buy oil, to trade internationally, and to hold in its central bank reserves. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar allowed the United States to print money endlessly, financing its wars and its deficits, knowing the rest of the world would absorb those dollars. In an act of supreme arrogance, in February 2022, Washington and its European allies decided to freeze, essentially steal, $300 billion of Russia's sovereign reserves. They thought this was a demonstration of strength. They thought this would bring Russia to its knees. It was, in fact, the greatest demonstration of weakness and desperation. They sent a message, not just to Moscow, but to the entire world. The message was, your money is not safe with us. Our rules, our systems, are not neutral. If you, at any point, disobey us, if you diverge from our foreign policy, we can and will take everything you have. The world heard this message, loud and clear. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, and even traditional allies like France, looked at this act and realized, instantly, that they needed an alternative. They realized that holding their reserves in dollars or euros was an existential risk. The freezing of Russian reserves was the true starting gun for the de-dollarization race. Washington, in its desperation to punish Russia, gave the BRICS bloc, China, and all nations seeking sovereignty the best sales pitch they could have ever wished for. They proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the dollar-based system is not a global public utility, it is a tool of imperial coercion. And now, what do we see? We see the world quietly building the emergency exits. China and Brazil striking deals to trade in their own currencies. Saudi Arabia publicly announcing it is open to selling oil in currencies other than the dollar, something unthinkable 3 years ago. Central banks across the global south buying gold at record levels to rid themselves of their dollar reserves. This process is slow, it is complex, but it is inexorable. Washington's arrogance did not break Russia, it broke the world's trust in the Western financial system. Finally, there is the military arrogance. The belief that Western technology, the wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, could defeat Russian industrial capacity en masse. First, it was the Javelin missiles. Then, it was the Bayraktar drones. Then, it was the HIMARS systems. Then, it was the Leopard and Abrams tanks. With every new miracle weapon sent, the Western media proclaimed that the tide has turned. This is theater. Ukraine, tragically, was flooded with equipment, but this does not change the industrial reality. Modern warfare, as Richard Wolff understands and as Russian generals understand, is not won by a few high-tech weapons. It is won by logistics, by the mass production of artillery, by the industrial capacity to replace losses. The West, in its neoliberal arrogance, outsourced its industrial base to China over the last 3 decades. The United States and Europe can no longer produce the amount of artillery ammunition that Russia fires in a single week. Russia, on the other hand, has put its economy on a war footing. Its factories are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, churning out tanks, missiles, and, most importantly, millions of artillery shells. The West believed its own propaganda that technology overcomes mass. Ukraine is paying the price for this illusion with the blood of its youth. Washington's arrogance, its refusal to accept a peace negotiation early on, its insistence on a strategic defeat of Russia, is what sealed Ukraine's fate. They sacrificed an entire nation on the altar of their own denial. And now, we come to the second half of this equation. The part that the Western media not only ignores but actively conceals. Because while they focus their cameras, day and night, on the desperation and weakness of the West, they avoid, at all costs, showing the other side of the coin, the quiet, strategic, and unstoppable rise of the multipolar world. Washington's arrogance, as Professor Wolff stated, did not just deliver Ukraine to Russia. It delivered the future to BRICS. Let us look at the evidence. The most profound consequence of the sanctions was not economic, it was diplomatic. Washington, by declaring total economic war on Russia, forced every non-aligned nation in the world to make a choice. And they chose. The BRICS bloc, which many Western analysts dismissed as a mere talking shop, a marketing acronym invented by Goldman Sachs, suddenly became the center of global resistance. In 2023, in the midst of this proxy war, what did we see? We saw a historic expansion of BRICS. We saw Saudi Arabia, the pillar of the petrodollar, America's most crucial ally in the Middle East for 70 years, formally join BRICS. We saw the United Arab Emirates, another Gulf financial pillar, do the same. We saw Iran, Washington's archenemy, brought into the same bloc, mediated by China. We saw Egypt, Ethiopia. This is not an accident. This is the direct result of Washington's arrogance. These nations saw what the United States did to Russia's reserves and understood that, to guarantee their own sovereignty, they could no longer keep all their eggs in the dollar basket. China, in particular, has played this game with a strategic mastery that the elites in Washington, obsessed with their short-term military victories, are incapable of comprehending. China set no weapons. China made no threats. China watched. It watched its primary strategic competitor, the United States, deplete its military stockpiles, drain billions of dollars from its already failed treasury, and, most importantly, alienate all of Europe, forcing it into deindustrialization. Meanwhile, what did China do? It bought energy. It bought Russian gas and oil at enormous discounts, solidifying its energy security and industrial advantage for decades to come. It watched Germany close its chemical plants, while its own operated at lower costs than ever. And, diplomatically, China positioned itself not as an aggressor, but as a peacemaker. It presented peace plans. It mediated the historic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, proving to the global south that an alternative exists to America's bombs or sanctions diplomacy. And then we have India. India is, supposedly, a pillar of the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China. India is part of the Quad alliance. And yet, when the war began, India categorically refused to sanction Russia. The elites in Washington were furious. They could not understand it. How dare they? India, demonstrating true multipolar sovereignty, acted in its own national interest. It saw Russian oil being sold at a discount and began buying it in record quantities. It increased its imports of Russian oil by more than 1,000%. And here is the supreme irony that exposes the entire charade. India refined that cheap Russian oil and then sold it, as gasoline and diesel, at an enormous profit, back to Europe. Europe, which refused to buy Russian oil directly on moral principles, was buying the exact same Russian oil, now laundered through India, at a much higher price. This is the multipolar world in action. It is not about ideology. It is about pragmatic national interests. It is about nations that no longer accept orders from Washington. The vast majority of the planet, what we call the global south, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, did not join the sanctions. They do not see Russia as the enemy. They see this as a proxy war by the old colonial empires, and they are tired of being pawns in their games. Washington's arrogance, therefore, failed to isolate Russia. Instead, it succeeded in isolating the West itself from the rest of the world. And this brings us to the central character in this theater of denial. The elites in Washington, both the Biden administration and the hawks in Congress, remain trapped in their script. They still speak of total victory, of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is an empty phrase. It is a political slogan to hide the reality that the arsenals are empty, the money is running out, and the public's political will is evaporating in the face of inflation and domestic problems. They are in profound denial, unable to admit defeat and negotiate an end, because admitting defeat in Ukraine is to admit the end of the unipolar era. But there is another character who personifies this denial in an even more grotesque fashion. And that character is Donald Trump. Trump represents the other side of the same imperial coin. He is the personification of the American arrogance that believes the world can be shaped by sheer force of will, by bluster, and by threats. When Trump says he will end the war in 24 hours, that is not a peace plan. It is the arrogance of an emperor who believes he can simply slam his fist on the table and make world leaders obey, as if they were managers at one of his failed casinos. He does not understand, or refuses to understand, the multipolar reality. He does not understand that Russia will not surrender and that China will not back down. The fundamental mistake of Trump, and the mistake of the entire Washington political class, is that they are still misdiagnosing the problem. Trump looks at America's decline and blames bad deals or the weakness of Joe Biden. He does not blame the system. He does not blame the fact that American neoliberal capitalism itself, which he and his billionaire friends promoted, is what exported America's industrial base, the Rust Belt, to China and Mexico. His solution? More arrogance. More tariffs. He promises a universal 10% tariff on all imports. He promises tariffs of 60% or more on China. He is applying the exact same flawed logic we have already exposed. He thinks the tariffs are paid by China. This is an economic lie. Tariffs are a tax paid by the American consumer. They are paid by you. He thinks he can force companies back to America with threats. But as we saw in the case of Stellantis, global capital will simply go where it is smarter, such as Canada, leaving the American worker behind. Trump is the ultimate symptom of denial. He distracts the American public. Instead of focusing on the systemic failure, on the collapse of real competitiveness, he points his finger at scapegoats. He says the problem is the immigrant crossing the border. He promises a wall. But the wall will not bring back the auto industry jobs. The wall will not stop the technological rise of BYD in China. The wall will not stop Saudi Arabia from selling oil in yuan. The wall is theater. It is a symbol to distract the populace from the inconvenient truth: the empire is bankrupt. The elites, both Democrat and Republican like Trump, have no answer for the decline except more debt, more money printing, more war, and more denial. And so, we come full circle. Professor Richard Wolff was absolutely correct. Washington's arrogance was the catalyst. The war in Ukraine will not be remembered as the great crusade for democracy that the Western media tried to sell. It will be remembered in the history books as the moment the American empire, in a final act of desperation, tried to stop the clock of history, and failed miserably. It will be remembered as the moment the sanctions backfired on the Western economy. The moment the freezing of Russian reserves exposed the dollar as a political weapon, accelerating its decline. And the moment the West's phantom industrial base was exposed, incapable of competing with the mass production of the multipolar world. The change is real. The change is inevitable. The denial in Washington, whether from Biden or from Trump, cannot stop this reality. But now, you, who have watched this analysis to the end, you are no longer in denial. You know the truth. If this analysis has made you see the world through different eyes, if you understand that there is a struggle for dignity happening, then do not remain silent. Share this video so that more people can understand what the mainstream media will never explain.